Now, open your Bibles to 1 Samuel chapter 16. Now, I'll be there in a moment. Let me get all these messages out of my way. Now, in this series, we've covered some topics concerning David. We looked at why David was called a man after God's own heart. What does someone look like that's after God's heart? We also looked at why David was willing to be God's servant. And one of the things we looked at to answer that question, he made his life available for God to use. He wasn't perfect. He was flawed, just like all of us. But God still used him because he wanted to serve God. But now when looking at the scriptures, the events that led up to David being chosen to be the future king, one that God chose to succeed Saul. Now Saul was rebellious. He sinned against God. And God was about to replace him. And David's biography in this part of his life begins with really looking at Samuel and the reasons why David was even chosen in the first place. Before that happened, though, he had to deal with Samuel. In verse 1, chapter 16, in 1 Samuel 16:1, it reads, "And the Lord said unto Samuel, How long wilt thou mourn for Saul?" There was no more hope for Saul. He rebelled against and sinned against God to the point where God was going to replace him, and Samuel knew it. And the Lord said unto Samuel, How long wilt thou mourn for Saul, seeing I have rejected him, God's rejection, from reigning over Israel? Fill thy horn with oil, and go, I will send thee to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided, and I've had you circle this word before or highlight it. Literally, it means to see with my own eyes. God has seen with his own eyes who he wants as the future king of Israel. I have seen with my own eyes a king among his sons. But let's stop and look at that verse. Before we even get to David, God had to deal with Samuel. He says, and the Lord said unto Samuel, How long wilt thou mourn for Saul? No matter which way you look at this verse, the Lord is getting on Samuel's case. The Lord is reprimanding Samuel in this verse. There's two clear problems with Samuel in this chapter. As I outlined these problems, you probably could identify it. I've been able to identify it in my own life during certain times during my lifetime as a Christian. what I have faced, the circumstances I've been in, the situations that I have been in. Problem number one with Samuel, he has not gotten over the past. Samuel was disappointed because he was close to Saul. Still, at this point, Saul was king. Now, Samuel was not close at this point in the timeline, but prior to that, he was close to Saul. He anointed Saul to be king. He discipled Saul for the kingship. Put flesh and blood in this story. Just don't read it. The problem is that Saul failed in his own eyes. And he couldn't get over the past. He's still mourning. And God had enough and tells him, how long will you mourn? He's reprimanding Saul. He was displeasing the Lord. And the Lord had to straighten him out before we even get to David. Samuel was still trying to hold on to the past. Like I said, identify with this message if it fits. He couldn't let that past go. This spiritual giant had the same kind of emotions and the same kind of feelings as we do. We tend to put these heroes of faith on a pedestal when you read through these stories. But they are also made of the same flesh and blood as we are. They, when you read through the story, in this case Samuel, also experienced the same feelings and the emotions that we do. Listen, I've had people in my life that I have discipled in the best way I could with the rightly divided word of God that completely went off track and separated themselves from the Lord. It's very disappointing. It's very discouraging. It's sad to see it happen. And you start looking at yourself and saying, where did I go wrong? What did I didn't say that could have helped them? What could I have done so it wouldn't reach the point where it went in that particular situation or circumstance? So I could put myself in this story and feel what Samuel was feeling. But there is a time when you have to move forward. Samuel in this verse was not there yet, and he needed some coercing from God to get him past that point. God was not going to let Samuel live on past regrets. And if God is still working in your life, you have to come to realize that He's not going to have you at a point in your life where you can't move forward because you just keep reliving the past in all its failures and regrets. Too many Christians never overcome past failures. They keep reflecting on the past over and over again and again. Now just think about this with me. Let's think through this. How many Christians through the centuries have become inactive and they just start sitting on the sidelines, watching the handful serve God? Think about it. They might say to themselves, I was in the heat of the battle once, and I got burned. I failed big time. Because of that, from that point on, they decided to place themselves in a safe place. Self-preservation kicks in. But that's not the only thing that kicks in. Sitting and moping in regrets does its number on individuals. In the New Testament, it was Paul that said, forget the past and press forward. And when you read this story, this is exactly what Samuel had to do. That was the first thing that I told you to take notice of. Now there's something else. Write this down as number 2 as we read on in this story. Let's read verses 2 and 3 in chapter 16. And Samuel said, how can I go? If Saul hears it, he will kill me. And the Lord said, take a heifer with thee, and say, I am come to sacrifice to the Lord. And call Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show thee what thou shalt do, and thou shalt anoint unto me whom I name unto thee. He was fearful for his life. Saul was still king. Imagine if he got word that Samuel was looking around for another king to anoint, to take his place. What do you think Saul would have done? Now, David didn't become king right away. Years went by. What do you think would have happened right away as soon as Saul got the word? He would send his mercenaries looking for Samuel. To kill him before he would anoint someone else. Obeying God sometimes can be dangerous. And Samuel was fearing, this is number 2, he was fearing an uncertain future. So what God does, it's kind of humorous when you read through it in these verses. He kind of disguises his primary motive by having Samuel bring a heifer and calling a sacrifice to the Lord. Did they sacrifice to the Lord? Yes. So it wasn't deception. It wasn't deceitful. They did that also. Sounds to me that Saul had spies following Samuel's every move. Saul knew his days were numbered, that he displeased the Lord. And there was, in his case, no redemption. He wanted to know everything that Samuel was doing. And so it was disguised as a sacrifice, which did happen, so it was not truthful, but it disguised the primary motive of what Samuel was going to accomplish, that God wanted done. Now, verse 4 and 5, and Samuel did which the Lord spake. Give him credit for that. And came to Bethlehem, and the elders of the town trembled at his coming, and said, Comest thou peacefully? Samuel must have had a reputation, if you think about it. I don't want to dwell on it, so let's move forward. And he said, Peacefully, I am come to sacrifice unto the Lord. Sanctify yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice. And he sanctified Jesse and his sons and called them to the sacrifice. Verse 6, and it came to pass when they were come that he looked on Eliab and said, Surely the Lord anointed is before him. Okay, he's at the sacrifice. And it came to pass when they were come that he looked on David's oldest son and said, Surely the Lord's anointed is before him. Now, here's Samuel jumping to conclusions. He concluded this was it. He didn't hear from God like he was instructed. He just jumped to that conclusion. But the Lord said unto Samuel, but God had none of it. Look not on his countenance or on the height of his stature, because I refused him. This ain't the one. For the Lord seeth not as man seeth, for man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looketh on the heart. The man looketh it with eyes is another translation. Eliab was probably the biggest, probably the strongest. He was the oldest, and probably the best looking of the bunch. The best looking of Jesse's sons. Doesn't that sound familiar? If you know your history, your Old Testament history concerning Saul, Saul had the same qualities. God didn't need another good-looking king. God needed someone that had a good heart and was willing to serve, and when necessary, take the correction that occasionally would come when his servant displeased him and knew if he got off track, which David did on occasion, he was sinning against God. He needed another prideful, arrogant king that cared less about what God would be pleased in. Samuel was willing to settle for another man like Saul. Now, if you think I'm pointing fingers at Saul, you're gravely mistaken. We had the same tendencies. We tend to judge people by their looks, or how much money they might have in their bank account, or maybe even their position. Definitely by the way they dress. Or maybe how big their house is. We tend to look externally. But God looks eternally. That's the difference. God chooses servants that have a desire to be led by Him. What does that look like? I've said it so many times. Servants who have a desire to deny themselves, take up the cross for Christ, and follow Him. Another psalm that David wrote, let me just go to it really quick. Psalm 51. David writes in verse 16, "For thou desirest not sacrifice, for thou desire not sacrifice, else would I give it. Thou delightest not in burnt offerings." What does God desire? He desired the truth. The way you felt about Him. A lot of people do things externally thinking that that's what's going to please God. My friends, He can look right through that and sees what's in your mindset and your heart, and how much you desire to be pleasing unto Him. Throughout David's life, you see, especially in the Psalms, his revealing of what God was looking for. Back to 1 Samuel. Still in chapter 16, as we kind of lead up to David once again, we look in verse 10. "And Jesse made 7 of his sons to pass before Samuel. And Samuel said unto Jesse, The Lord hath not chosen thee." These. The Lord has not chosen these. 7 sons. Not one was chosen. Samuel looked over, and the sons as they went by, and he didn't hear that voice of the Lord saying, "That's the one." Probably, if you go by looks, and that's all you could go on, and I'll tell you why in a minute. If you go by looks, they probably were all king material by looks. But that's not what God was looking for. Now, I am convinced, after analyzing the scriptures, David being the youngest, in Jesse's eyes. Probably meant that he was the least important. Now, how do you come to those conclusions? By being biblical detectives. When you analyze the scriptures, you just don't see a loving relationship with David and his father. You just don't see it. David had 7 brothers and 2 sisters. And he was the youngest. So 10 children in total, and he was the youngest. In fact, his siblings were having children that was his age. They had children that was his age when he was born. The same age as he was when he was chosen to be king. So you see the difference there. He had much older siblings. He was the youngest. And he had relatives that already was his age that his siblings bore. He was the youngest. Now, putting flesh and blood in the story still, Jesse's probably looking at this as an opportunity to live a different type of life, escape from the life that he was living if one of his sons were made king. So he's hoping one of these 7, because in his eyes, one of these 7 has to be what Samuel's looking for. No way David can be. Now, they were not a wealthy family. Once again, when you analyze the scriptures, they were poor. It may be even living a life of borderline poverty. It's a lot of mouths to feed, a big family. And how do you come to that conclusion? Now, the family livelihood, if you read the history, was sheep. If you know the social culture of that time period, it was one of the poorest occupations of that time period. And on top of that, the flock of sheep was small. Turn over a few chapters to chapter 17, verse, like I said, being biblical detectives, the answers are there. Verse 28. And Eliab and his brother heard when he spake unto the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David. And he said, Why camest thou hither? And with whom hast thou left those few sheep in the wilderness? Few sheep. They don't even have a large flock of sheep to tend to. They have a few sheep. There's another hint of how poor they probably were. That's the first clue. Go to 1 Samuel 17, still same chapter. Verse 18. And here, David's father is giving instruction again to David to go deliver a gift. And carry these 10 cheeses, or cuts of cheeses, unto the captain of their 1,000, and look how thy brethren fare, and take their pledge. This refers to a gift that was given to the commander or captain of the army. And literally 10 cuts of cheese. Now this was, once and again, understanding the social culture of the time, this was a common and ordinary gift that you would give someone that was important. And then there's another gift. In 1 Samuel 16, verse 20, it reads, "And Jesse took an ass laden with bread, and a bottle of wine, and a kid, and sent them by David his son to Saul." He sends a gift to the king also. What is he sending him? Grain and wine. Understanding the social culture again, which I haven't got time to go into to explain it all. That kind of gift revealed a lack of wealth. Not from somebody that was wealthy would even think about giving in that time period that type of gift. So, it was not a wealthy family. David was probably the least favored child, at least the least favored son of the 8 sons that Jesse had. David being the 10th child, much later in their parents' life. If you think about it in today's terms, it probably put a financial strain in their finances. I am trying to make the story real for you. I'm trying to put flesh and blood in this story. And we know, perhaps, this is why his father and David probably had a poor relationship. Now, I'm running out of time, so I have to speed this along. Secondly, we see over and over that David was frequently used in playing a servant's role. I think that was God's way of preparing him, whether he knew it or not. But in that day, that time period, it was servants, if you could afford them, who were hired to watch the sheep. And since David's family probably couldn't afford it, David became the servant who would watch the sheep. And you'll be out there in the elements. And once you're out there, it was filled with all kinds of dangers and difficulties. Write it down in your notes. I don't have time to go to it, but in 1 Samuel 17, verses 34 through 7, you see David encountering a lion and a bear, which he was successful in defeating and protecting the sheep. So he was the servant of the family out there tending to the sheep. Now that's not the only clue. We know that David also, when we just covered it, delivered gifts to the commander, the captain of the army, and then also to Saul, the king of Israel. What does that tell us? Putting flesh and blood in the story again? That he was reduced to an errand boy by his father. The third point, when you really put flesh and blood in the story, it seems like David was ignored by his father. You look at 1 Samuel 16, verse 11. And Samuel said unto Jesse, Are here all thy children? Now Samuel has not got the word from the Lord yet that any one of these sons were the ones. Now Samuel thought that he knew better, but God didn't give him the word. And he said, and Samuel said to Jesse, Are here all thy children? He said, There remaineth yet the youngest. And behold, he keepeth the sheep. And Samuel said unto Jesse, Send and fetch him, for we will not sit down until he come hither. Now, there remains the youngest. Now I want you to notice something here. Once again, you read right by this verse. And Samuel said to Jesse, Are here all thy children? And he said, There remaineth yet the youngest, and behold, he keepeth the sheep. And look what happens next in this verse. And Samuel said, you almost could sense when you're reading this verse that there was a hesitation between the word sheep and between the phrase he keepeth the sheep and Samuel said. I bet you Jesse was waiting for Jesse to volunteer for someone to go get David from the field he was in. But there's no place here in the scriptures where we can read that says that Jesse says, Yes, I have another son. Let me go get him. That doesn't happen here. It's almost like Samuel had to coerce him into getting David from the field to bring him in so he could walk by Samuel also to see if this is what God chooses. The last remaining hope. Of the bunch of sons in Jesse's family. He doesn't say, Wait a minute, Samuel, just wait here and I'll go get him. No. It tells me that Jesse never had any intention of sending forth David in the first place. It took Samuel to say what he did say after that, to convince someone, Jesse that is, to go get David, his youngest son. It's almost like if you get in their mindset, Jesse's mindset is, you can't be serious. David? No way he could be king. He's just a young lad with an overactive imagination. He's always playing his musical instrument out there, singing songs to the Lord, writing poetry, whatever. What does he know about running a nation? I'm not being too presumptuous, I think. I'm putting flesh and blood in the story. Jesse said, Send him and bring him. And we're not going to sit down until you do so. Sounds like to me, Jesse, to the very last moment, was resisting his son David to becoming a potential king. Now take it one step further. Imagine that the community that Samuel was coming to knew that obviously that he was coming and he was going to sacrifice unto the Lord, and he called Jesse's family to the event. Imagine if you're David out there. He probably didn't even know what was going on. Nobody thought it was important for him to know. He was just a servant out there tending the sheep, playing his songs, writing his poetry, doing whatever he does out there. Not even included an important event as Samuel sacrifices and visits your home. I don't think David knew about it. Even in those days, news traveled fast. The most prestigious and important spiritual leader of your time coming to have dinner at your home, and everyone in your family is invited but you. That's why I've concluded David didn't have that kind of relationship with his father. Not once. You can comb the scriptures if you want to. If you don't want to take my word for it, David ever mentions his father in his writings. Now, he did mention his mother twice. I think I have time to go to it. Psalm 18. No, is it Psalm 18? No, Psalm 86. Psalm 86, you should write this down because I'm going to go fast through these scriptures. Just trying to lay down the groundwork of why I've concluded what I've concluded that I'm presenting to you tonight. Psalm 86, verse 16. O turn unto me and have mercy upon me. This is David's cry for help in this psalm. Give thy strength unto thy servant, and save the son of thy handmaid. And he says the same thing again in Psalm 116. I believe it's verse 16 also. Yes. O Lord, truly I am thy servant. I am thy servant and thy son of thy handmaid. That's where he references his mother, but never his father. No. In verse 16, verse 12 in 1 Samuel again, chapter 16, we see as the story progresses, and he sent and brought him, and now he was ruddy, and withal of a beautiful countenance, and goodly to look to. And the Lord said, Arise, anoint him, for this is he. The word ruddy there is literally red. He had either auburn or reddish color hair. And he was an attractive young man. So it really makes you wonder why Jesse didn't even bother to call him in. Why was David chosen? He was a nobody. That's the way his family viewed him. I don't think he had the respect of his brothers, or he was even respected by his father or appreciated by his father. He was just a poor kid living on the wrong side of the tracks. How would this kid become king of Israel one day? How would that be done? If you look at 1 Samuel 13, as I start concluding this, message tonight, you read in verse 14, "But now thy kingdom shall not continue," referring to Saul. "The Lord has sought him a man after his own heart, and the Lord had commanded him to be captain over his people, because thou hast not kept which the Lord commandeth." What does a man after God's own heart mean? We've been looking at that. An individual who's after God's own heart is a person or an individual who relates everything. And we can see that in the scripture. Who relates everything in his life or in life that he's experiencing to his relationship with God. And you see that over and over in David's life. One of the Psalms, I was not going to go to it, but I think I am. Psalms 8 is one of the Psalms that he wrote when he was out there in his younger part of his life tending sheep. Turn to it quickly. Psalms 8. We read, remember I said, an individual who's after God's own heart is an individual who relates everything in life to his relationship with God. And you read this and you see this just jump out in the pages when you read through the Psalms. This is an early psalm, early in his life, before he became king, tending the sheep out there in the wilderness. "When I consider thy heavens," verse 3, Psalm 8, "when I consider thy heavens, the work of thy fingers, the moon and the stars, which thou hast ordained." "What is a man that thou art mindful of him, and the son of man that thou visit him?" And he goes on to say in verse 9, "O Lord, our Lord, how excellent is thy name in all the earth." While he's out there, and he's observing the heavens, and the stars and the moon at night, experiencing that moment that he's experiencing in his life. And you see this not just with this event, but all the events of his life over and over again, and how he relates what he's experiencing at that time in his life to his relationship with God. David learned how to relate everything in life, everything that he experienced, everything that he saw, everything that he felt, to his relationship with his out there in those lonely fields at night, to his only companion, to his rock, to his Redeemer, to his Lord. Now, David had 7 brothers. 7 older brothers. Grew up in the same household. Probably wandered through the same areas that he wandered through. And more than likely loved more by his father, their father. So they had probably greater advantages, even though they were a poor family. But at least their father was proud of them. Proud enough to introduce them to Samuel. Not one of them, and I repeat, not one of them was a man after God's own heart. They could have been, but they were not. Why? Because they didn't choose to have that relationship with God that David did. They didn't choose to make God the priority like David did. Some of you might be in that position today, and you probably have all the excuses that you want to make, that you can muster it up in your imagination of your mind. Well, if I was just in a different kind of circumstances, if I had a different job, maybe if I had a loving mother or father, whatever the reasons you could come up with. If your heart does not hunger for God, in the circumstances you're in now, the situation in life has put you in the now, let me tell you, if they do improve, it will not make your hunger for God any different. There in the lowliness of those hillsides, tending sheep, playing the role of a servant or a slave, probably ostracized by his father and his brothers, definitely not appreciated. What did David do? So don't give me your excuses. He fell in love with God. What did David do? He spent time with God alone. He developed an intimate relationship with God. Not by coincidence. It was on purpose. A person after God's own heart is a person like David, who with all their heart is pursuing God. One last verse, Jeremiah chapter 29. Verse 13. Now he's speaking to a nation, but individualize this tonight. Quit the excuse making and start pursuing God. And ye shall seek me and find me when ye shall search for me with all your heart. And look at the beauty of this next verse. And I will be found of you. What a promise, saith the Lord. And I will be found of you. That's the Lord declaring that promise. But what does it require? A pursuing of God with passion. You read about the only statement of faith that you can find on the website. I mentioned that word passion. And how we are to be passionately pursuing God. If you passionately keep pursuing God and wanting that relationship with Him, the intimate relationship that David had, you got to quit making excuses why you can't because of your circumstances. Why you can't because of your situations. And even like we covered in the beginning of this message, because you think you failed in the past. You have past failures and regrets, and it's keeping you from serving God. Those are just excuses. We're all going to fail. We're all going to have past regrets. We're all going to fall on our face. But God will lift us up and put a new mindset in us if we pursue Him with passion, and cause us to press forward to reach that prize, and to be also labeled as a person after God's own heart. David had everything going against him. So what did he do? He pursued God. That's what made him different from the rest of his family. He pursued God when they, as we can tell, as best as we can tell in the scriptures, they did not. God's looking for pursuers. And when He does find them, He says, I will be found of you, and I will not turn you away. So let's start, if you haven't already, pursue God with the passion. And let's seek what God wants. And become people like David that have a heart that God can see as an individual to be used as His servant to accomplish what He desires from us. You got it? If you do, I want to hear from you. Play a song.